to our second round of questions here, and I'd like to ask each of you to highlight one to two future questions or issues companies would likely have to address relative to your topic, and or issues you expected to hear in your working group but did not. And so if we can take another 5 minutes each and reverse the order. So Becca, will have you start, then John can go next, then Brad, then JR. Go ahead, Becca.
Sure. So, one of the issues that came up was employee perceptions and feelings about returning to the office versus continuing to work remotely and everything in between, all the options we know that exist in between. So one thing that did come up in my group was the fact that in some cases, employees might not always be thinking about the kind of the long-term implications of how and where they're working. So for example, one participant shared that younger generations, which we know are more likely to want to continue working remotely, may not necessarily be thinking about the longer term implications for developing mentoring and professional networks of just sort of working at home and not having those informal interactions in the office. One thing that didn't come up that I think is connected to that and that I think is important to consider is how to think about negotiating these different employee preferences, given that the implications aren't always straightforward and that these preferences were developed within a particular context of each type of work. So employees who have preferences about working in the office develop those preferences based on a prior time when everyone was working in the office. We know that having some reasonable number of people in the office may be important to a rewarding experience of actually being there in person. At the same time, people who express preferences to work remotely are doing so in a time when just about everyone else that they're working with is working remotely as well. Their interactions, their attendance at meetings is likely to be different and have it feel like a different experience when those meetings are taking place in a hybrid format. So thinking about negotiating not just how do we account for different individual preferences, but what do those look like when we put them all together and put all those different options that we give employees together, I think is an important issue that will definitely need attention moving forward. One other somewhat related point is that what did come up in my working group was the fact of these generational differences. So younger generations tend to, have these greater preferences and greater comfort working remotely. One question that I think is worth looking at in the long term is, to the extent that we accommodate workers' preferences and where and how they're working, is this likely to exacerbate generational divides that we already see in the workplace and organizations? And you can also imagine other demographic divides where we see differences in preferences, which we have addressed from in prior working groups and webinars from kind of a DEI perspective, but just in terms of any kinds of differences, sort of systematic differences in the types of employees or characteristics of employees that prefer working in one mode or another, what does that mean in terms of their future interactions and relationships within the organization?
Great. Brad, let's go to you next.
Sure. So, I think there was a couple issues that kind of caught my attention as we kind of looked, a bit towards the horizon. One is, and we've touched on it a bit already, but is really kind of leadership development and what the future holds in that space in particular. We've seen some interesting trends over the last kind of year and a half as you look at various benchmarking studies out there that kind of really go against the long history of kind of trends in the learning and development space. So one is we saw a significant reduction in spending in the leadership development space, and leading up to the present, L&D. Leadership development is always one of those areas that got the bulk of training funds and was kind of front and center. And I think companies were investing heavily to build that next generation of leaders. So I think there's a question of, is this just the case of companies, maybe putting some programs on pause because they're not a good fit for virtual learning and we're going to see those investments come back? Or is this kind of a more permanent maybe shift of training dollars into some areas and not others? I think similarly thinking about how will leadership development be delivered in the future. A number of participants in a working group talked about, executive appetite for learning virtually is probably higher now that they've been forced to do it and have experienced it. But again, as we talked about earlier, what do we lose by just doing, virtual learning for, leaders and new managers? We lose that social interaction. We lose the networking components that Becca was just talking about, which might have important implications. And perhaps, maybe most importantly to some of the comments earlier is really thinking about what do leaders need to be effective in the kind of new normal that's going to be the post-pandemic environment. There's some obvious things around kind of leading hybrid and remote teams. Those are kind of things that companies are already working on. But I think we'll see leaders increasingly being asked to really drive inclusion in their kind of work groups. They'll be asked to really kind of think about how the way they manage impact employee health and well-being. So I think these will be new issues that will require, some attention through leadership development. The second, kind of future issue, which really didn't come up in our working group, and I was a little bit surprised, but is really around the future of diversity training. We did a CAHRS study this past spring, focused on DE&I, and what we saw there is, companies are at different stages of kind of maturity in their DE&I strategy. And what we see is that as those strategies mature, companies' emphasis on diversity training, or at least what they're focusing on in that space, really evolves. So early on, it might be around just kind of awareness and unconscious bias training. But then as we see companies mature, we see them focusing on other topics: allyship, microaggressions, inclusive leadership. And so I think as we continue to push these DE&I agendas, really thinking about what should the focus of those training efforts be. Again, how should they be delivered? Because I think diversity training has been a place where we've always said it really should be in person, so we can have those really rich discussions and have that kind of high touch environment. So really thinking about not only what we're focusing on, but how that type of training is delivered in the future, I think will be some important questions for companies to tackle.
Yeah, good insights there. John, how about you?
Sure. So two thoughts on this. I think one, I was maybe a bit surprised at how much there's a short-term focus right now on managing attrition and its impact. I think it's maybe understandable just given the sharp increase we've seen, but a lot of short-term solutions around spot bonuses or pay raises, very comp focused. We know from the turnover literature that compensation is a pretty weak driver of retention. And so, I think as we look ahead into, the longer term, it seems like a longer term focus on how you manage attrition as an organization is becoming more critical or more important. It seems to be becoming more of a business issue, not just an HR issue. We've heard of several companies where, the turnover and vacancies are causing production delays, which is obviously causing revenue shortfalls and customer orders to be canceled. And so now that turnover is clearly impacting operations and business outcomes, I think it's coming more to the forefront for business leaders. And so, thinking more long-term about what is our approach to attrition as an organization. Are we going to build in buffers for the next time some economic crisis or other major event disrupts the organization? What does this look like from a HR practice standpoint to build systems that are geared towards attrition just as much as performance or anything else? And I think the last piece is that I think what we've seen here from the current environment is that turnover is now sort of a business risk, just like any other business risk, in the sense that your talent is leaving and causing disruptions that are very difficult to come back from. So I think that's one key bucket area. And I think the other is maybe selfishly as a researcher, do we know what's working and what's not working? This is like the best opportunity for experimentation in organizations. We have this major upheaval. Companies, I think, want to find solutions that are actually effective. And so wouldn't it be ideal if we could collect some data to understand in different locations, maybe what interventions to address turnover are more or less effective, and then be able to kind of scale those more broadly. I think right now there's a little bit of, kind of, again, short-term frantic reaction, understandably so. But if we had good data on this going forward, I think, it would benefit companies and, more broadly benefit our understanding of what's effective in curbing turnover. So those would be the kind of two key buckets, I would say.
Yeah. Hey, JR, how about some of the future focus areas you heard in your working groups?
Yeah, well, I think one of the things that we talked about, one of the most visible changes in the candidate experience was the shift to virtual interviews, right? Because you couldn't really invite, or many organizations stopped inviting people to campus, if you will, right, to have in-person interviews. And it led to a little discussion, and I wish we would have had more time for this on, I think, really, what is the future of the interview in the candidate experience? Lots of organizations have experimented with the use of virtual interviewing platforms where they put in questions and then candidates record the interviews. Some of the companies have had really good success with that. Some are much more skeptical about it. I think it raises this really interesting question of, what do we want the interview to do, right? In a lot of ways, the virtual sort of the platform interviewing does a lot of things that we know really help for evaluating candidates. You have a standard set of questions. Everybody answers the same questions. You can provide ratings, very soon after reviewing. You can review candidates all at once, right? Very similarly. But it eliminates the recruiting aspect of the interview, right? We think of hiring as a two-sided matching process. You're not showing individuals the culture, the location, their coworkers, what it would be like to work there. And so I think there's this question of how much emphasis on the interview part of the candidate experience / hiring process do we want to put on evaluating candidates versus sort of selling candidates there. And then, the other piece becomes who is involved in the interview process. In some ways, it's made it much more easy to have managers more involved in the interview process early on, because you can just stick somebody on a 30-minute Zoom call, and they don't have to worry about taking somebody out to lunch or actually physically moving from one location to another to be able to meet a candidate. But this raises the same questions, right? In terms of, are you getting that same personalized interaction? Are you getting a good sense of the candidate? Are you really evaluating them well? How much are you selling? And so I think there's this real open question on, do we want to go back to how it was? Do we want to keep it how we've done it virtually? Do we maybe want to, in some cases, get rid of the interview altogether? And so I think, to John's point, it's this chance of thinking about, if we're bulk hiring maybe for a set of positions, do we want to try a couple different ways and then test the results and really see what can work, what might be the future for your particular organization and for particular roles?